Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss the wildfires in LA and the post re-election vibe shift reflected in a whole new tone from corporate America. I'm joined by Frawley and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. On Monday at Compact, we published Adam Kirsch's really impressive essay, When the Fire Comes. Kirsch, a native of LA, author of a book of very good poems on LA, and a penetrating literary critic, wrote for us about the visions of destruction that various writers and thinkers have offered up about LA. I've spent a little time there. I thought it was awfully nice, but it's just a place that people at some level feel needs to burn. Geoff, do you think Kirsch is onto something? LA evokes this desire for destruction.
I do. I think, he captures it. I was thinking about this as well, although I was more thinking about it in terms of the climate narrative and the particular mode of kind of apocalyptic feeling and sort of prophecy that tends to summon up. But I think Kirsch, goes kind of deeper into the local sort of literary imagination to, find, I suppose, some of the more, specific cultural roots of this in the Los Angeles sort of literary and cultural tradition, going back to Nathaniel West's The Day of the Locust. I was glad he wrote about that. I often think that Nathaniel West is one of the most underrated American writers, but particularly The Day of the Locust and Miss Lonely Hearts, both fantastic, kind of extremely dark novels of the 1930s, 1940s. But in any case, yeah, I mean, I think there's some sense of LA as the end of the line. He talks about the Kirsch talks about the frontier. He talks about what it means to have kind of to have gone west and arrived at the end of the continent. And, on one hand, having arrived in an incredibly pleasant setting, which offers up, many, many pleasures to the senses, both natural, through the extremely benevolent climate, pleasant landscapes, and sea breezes, and at the same time, artificial pleasures, being in the center of the entertainment industry. And so he talks about it as a land of the lotus eaters, much like in the Odyssey, but that the undercurrent of this is some kind of sense that, this can't go on, that, this is an unsustainable situation, in part because it seems to represent this kind of descent into a kind of soporific lotus eating, world of permanent pleasure. And so, something has to give. So I thought that was very powerful. I kind of made a similar or related set of points in the Substack post I wrote in it last week. But, there again, I tried to tie it more to this kind of climate apocalypticism, which I think is often really tied to this notion that Western civilization has simply gone too far, right? That we've reached some kind of limit. We've reached, again, the end of the line. And I think, LA can be, one version of this, right? It's an artificial city in all kinds of ways, right? I mentioned it's the center of the sort of, world of sort of fantasy and dream production that is the entertainment industry. At the same time, it's a city that relies on incredible feats of engineering, right, to provide water to its large number of inhabitants. There's no way without the incredible feats of engineering that would have been impossible, really prior to the 20th century, that a city like that on that scale could exist. Joan Didion, who Kirsch discusses, has another in her essay about the Santa Ana winds, right, which sort of carried the fire, and have this kind of even Didion writing in 1967 had this kind of sense of them as a kind of apocalyptic force of nature that would kind of bring man's hubris to ruin in some sense. She has another essay called "At the Dam" about the Hoover Dam, right, which is part of this vast engineering infrastructure, much of it built in the early 20th century, that delivers water to California, right, and makes this vast human settlement possible. And it's a very striking and haunting essay, because what she imagines is a world in which humanity has ceased to exist. She doesn't necessarily explain why, but she imagines some point in the future at which the human population of this part of the world has, for whatever reason, vanished. But the dam, the Hoover Dam, is such an incredible feat of engineering that it continues to function in the same way, right? It continues to dam off and channel water from the Colorado River. I think, and she ends the essay, to a world in which in which there is no one, or in which no human remains. So she imagines, the engineering feats required to create this Southern California civilization, in some sense, outliving humanity itself. So it's quite a strange and haunting essay. I would also recommend, but I think for her, there's still a kind of awe at the achievement. Whereas I think with the climate apocalypticism, there's simply a kind of horror at the sense of overreach. And the sense that again, kind of something has to give, that, the civilization has gone too far and sort of needs to be pared back in some sense. And so there's kind of a paradox in this, because I think a lot of the sort of, progressive climate response to this, which has informed a lot of the media coverage, is on one hand to say, well, we're just getting what we deserve in that we haven't dealt with the climate issue. Now, there are various quibbles you could have with that, one of which is just that, as Leighton Woodhouse argued in a controversial piece last week, this is simply a fire-prone environment. It's this type of ecology and landscape has simply always had wildfire as a part of it. It's as central to its functioning as rain. So there's no way of imagining a wildfire-free California, whether or not a human impact on the climate has increased the likelihood of that. This civilization would always have to exist in some way in relation to the constant threat of wildfire. But I think what's striking is, on one hand, this idea that we somehow are kind of getting our comeuppance for not dealing with these issues, but at the same time that on some level, this according to this narrative, this whole operation is simply unsustainable, and that there's some kind of implication that something radical has to change, but it doesn't seem to me there's really a particularly clear positive plan for this, other than kind of very long term whatever global emissions standards that will somehow bend the curve. But that, it doesn't seem to me that really addresses the immediate problem, which, even if you take the worst climate prognoses very seriously, is that a lot of people do live in these places, and regardless of how things go, they are going to be at risk of these types of fires. And so what is missing, I would argue, is a willingness to and a sort of interest in undertaking the kinds of vast, civilization enabling projects that made this kind of settlement possible in the first place. Because honestly, that's what is, in my view, needed if we want to continue to have civilization in these places. It isn't clear to me that a large part of the sort of mainstream opinion actually wants that. It seems to be stuck instead in this extremely dark and pessimistic place. But
Yeah, there's
my
this
view, we
whole
need. Yeah.
phenomenon with national parks in the U.S. Some of the most beautiful places we have, uh, and the idea of the national park is to return nature to a state of wilderness. Really kind of outside human intervention. And one of the funny things about this is that there is no American uh, kind of landscape or ecology that we have any access to or knowledge of that wasn't shaped by man. Uh, there were people here. They didn't just run around the woods non-interferingly, but would clear underbrush, would do various things to shape and reshape the landscape, to husband animals. There's a fine essay by the late Australian poet Les Murray called "A Working Forest," also the title of a book of his, about this in the uh, Australian context. And that idea, I think it would be healthy if we could uh, discard the idea that there is a landscape without man. It can be done more or less beautifully. I'm not saying that maximum exurban sprawl is the correct way to do this, but there's a Christian vision, which I draw on, that man is charged with subduing nature, with exercising a kind of stewardship over it, and I think that vision is better aligned with technological progress and civilizational upbuilding than some of the darker green visions you have today. You know, I've I have friends who are involved in the tech world, and there some people are working on things like weather control, controlling the weather, which sounds maximally sinister. But interestingly, some of these people are Christian. When you speak to them, they explain it in terms of a responsibility to steward nature, and they say, "Look, we build levees around rivers, we build dams, we control water, and that way, why shouldn't we control the rivers in the sky?" And when I first encountered this argument, it really struck me, and I had to, think, okay, I do have somewhat Luddite instincts on this. Whatever, spraying some kind of metallic particles into the air just sounds bad, but uh, I do think we need to at least be open to the idea of management, whether it's something more humble like clearing brush or doing controlled burns. Um, be because that's certainly uh, an ancient part of human practice, or even much more extreme kind of futuristic technological visions. I think we should reject a kind of green apocalypticism that somehow man making his mark on nature is to be deplored.
It's funny that you should say that, because I was going to say there is something quite Christian about this, but in the sense of obviously like Sodom and Gomorrah and
Totally,
like
totally.
Babylon and all that sort of thing. Like, oh, it's this city of sin. Don't turn back. You'll be turned into a pillar of salt. Like that kind of there's this very clear, and it obviously runs through the article that we started out this conversation talking about, where at the end of the article he says, but the imagination doesn't take an interest in accidental suffering. There fire remains purgation, punishment, deliverance, especially when it happens in Los Angeles. Funny, because I'm not totally confident in my pronunciation of things, but anyway. Uh, um, and um, and he says, LA burns, its prophets obscurely feel, because it is destined to and even wants to. And that I don't know if it's because in our folklore, this kind of motif of the evil city, the city of sin that is destroyed for its moral failings, is so ingrained that when we want to tell a story, make sense of it, we make sense of it in this kind of moral fairy tale, or in this kind of morality play. But I find it interesting because In the folklore, it's like it's man's folly. Man is driven to this kind of desire for luxury or hubris or sin or sexuality or depravity or whatever it might be, and then God kind of rains down this punishment, this judgment. But in our world, you know, we're kind of reaching the end of this. I'm trying everything I can to avoid saying the word dialectic. So we were sort of projecting onto God our own feeling of powerlessness, right? So, you know, in these pre-modern folk tales, we were thrown about by fate. And but we are human beings. We are in this peculiar, among all animals, we're in this sort of peculiar state of being subject to fate, particularly historically, but also having reason, the ability to reflect and choose and make judgments. And this is very difficult to reconcile with a world that is so determined and was for the ancients, right? So what you do is you project all of that onto God and you give God the agency that you don't have yourself. And now we live in a world where we are reaching to become God. We have this power of creation that we could only imagine God to have, but we're not there. So we attribute to humans a godlike power of destruction, but not a godlike power of creation. And you know, it does have a kind of, it has the positive side to this owes a debt to Christianity because it centers human beings, right? And human beings are made in the image of God. But it's a debt that's long since been repaid, in my opinion. And that we might have to kind of take this step and realize that we are God. We are God. And that is in the sense of, you know, it was us all along. But we are now realizing really in the world what that actually means, that we have the power both to destroy but also to create. And I think because we're stuck, we're not fully able to make that step, we get stuck in these kinds of narratives of destruction where God is gone. It's not the retribution of God, it's us and our destructive tendencies. And I see this with one of the more interesting things that's come out of this is the way that conspiracies have kind of risen up around this. And I don't want to give you like a basic sociology 101 of conspiracy. Everybody's probably heard this before. But the thing about conspiracy that sociologists always say is that it attributes this sort of causal power to human agency, right? And in that way, it is very comforting because it is scary to be thrown about in a world that is completely beyond your control. And we tell stories about the world that give it meaning. And that's why folklore does this, right? Well, why did this happen? Oh, God did it, right? And so what we're doing is we're kind of, when we tell conspiracy theories, we say, well, someone is actually in control here. Somebody did this, right? And this is actually comforting. So it's, all the, I don't know, just to give a kind of overview of some of the conspiracies. So like there are arson theories, people saying that the fires were deliberately set. Even some celebrities have said this. One of the more bizarre ones is that there are these what are called direct energy weapons that set fires through high-powered energy beams, and or that there was a desire to create these smart cities, and this requires this enormous destruction to be able to build these 15-minute cities on a blank slate, all of this stuff. And so it's actually, the conspiracies are the flip side of the environmentalists, because the environmentalists attribute all causation to human destructiveness, but no agency to human creation. So like we caused all these problems. Oh, it's so awful. And it's like God and his wrath on us in a way, because there's nothing we can do about it. Like if you're going to say like, okay, we built these cities in this particular area and this happens, then, we can kind of understand the problem and come up with some immediate solutions. But if it's climate change, it's like this world epochal shift. And it's like, why bother? Why bother? And it's like fate for us. And conspiracy does the same thing. It's giving this agency to destructiveness, but not to the creative side. It's like, oh, these human beings, because of their hunger for power. Whenever I ask a conspiracy theorist, like, well, why? Why would people do that? They always say, oh, it's human nature. People just want more power. People just want more power, right? It's the same kind of thing. It's like saying it's just fate. It's God's will. or in the environmentalists, it's like it's human nature, it's humans, it's our hubris, it's our greed, it's our consumptiveness, it's all these sorts of things. So I think to kind of put that in a sentence, I think because we're not able to reach toward a kind of more positive narrative for human action, we have been constantly, it's not a simple sentence, we're constantly sort of thwarted in that. We are stuck and are constantly driven to understand our catastrophes through, or our crises, through narratives of human agency in terms of destructiveness, but not human agency in terms of finding a solution.
I was just going to point people to Holly Buck's piece for Compact last year called The Rise of Green MAGA, which talks in part about how, certain, you brought up the direct energy weapons, which you were brought up around the hurricane in the South, in North Carolina last year too. It's become a kind of go-to explanation for certain, people in the, I suppose, sort of Alex Jones to Marjorie Taylor Greene sphere of the right. But these ideas have been around for a long time. And, what's striking to me here and in the Substack post I wrote last week is, I remembered how, it was common going back to Hurricane Katrina and earlier, you'd have these prominent figures on the sort of evangelical religious right, like Pat Robertson. Whenever there's a natural disaster, it's like, well, it's God just punishing the depravity of secular civilization. It's Sodom and Gomorrah. But, interestingly, the right narratives have sort of shifted where there's actually a turn away from these kind of more metaphysical or theological explanations. And instead you get, on one hand, I suppose in the mainstream right, what you get is, well, it's because DEI messed up the fire department and they couldn't function because they hired all these incompetent people, diversity hires. And, for all I know, I haven't looked into it deeply. There's, possibly something to that, but it's sort of made the central culprit of all of this. And then at the same time, so it's a much more immediate kind of political blame game, right? Where it's ultimately really just the opposite. It's a much less grandiose kind of explanatory framework. Whereas and then the other fringe of the right is kind of focused more on these kind of weird fantasies of technological control, where it's direct energy weapons. Marjorie Taylor Greene, of course, they can control the weather. Little does she know about Matthew's friends who are, Christians working on controlling the weather, because I don't think that's what she meant when she said they. But it's interesting to see the right actually kind of retreating from these grander and kind of focusing actually on these much more kind of secular explanatory frameworks to push the narratives of the sort Ashley was describing, whereas it's the left that's actually, I think, zoomed out to this kind of vast apocalyptic vision. And instead, and you don't see as much, whereas with Katrina, let's say, the left was very focused on the incompetence of the Bush administration. It's the FEMA, the guy FEMA who is appointed to lead FEMA is just a sort of inept Bush crony. Like, there's less of that and more of just this kind of every natural disaster is a referendum on modern civilization as a whole. So it's been interesting to see those kind of narratives shift over the past decade or two.
Yeah, I do think Ashley raises a really interesting point about the religious character of these visions of destruction and about the kind of sense of resignation, kind of quasi-religious kind of resignation or fatalism that seems to pervade environmental discourse. And, in Ashley's account, part of this just lies at the feet of Christianity's moral legacy. If the system itself has been broken up, then some of its remains are weighing us down. And I think that's something for Christians like myself to really think about, because in a previous age, St. Augustine wrote his great City of God, such a marvelous book to read, to really answer the charge that Christians were weakening the Roman city, that they were bad for the polity. And Christians, especially as some of their moral kind of language, and many Christians themselves uh, kind of stand in the way of technological or material progress. I think there is a burden on other Christians to explain how uh, this is a religion that calls for man's cooperation with what we view as a divine task of creation and of building the world, of making it more whole. So I think that'll be a big burden for Christians. But enough of all that stuff. Since Trump's election, especially, we've seen a big change from American corporations, and really coming, I'd say, centrally from the tech world. Uh, you have some of the wealthiest men in the United States, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg, setting an entirely new line. You saw this begin before November 6th, when Jeff Bezos said that the Washington Post would not be endorsing any presidential candidate, and that he wanted to bring in more conservative writers at the Washington Post. Then, after the election, you had Mark Zuckerberg come out and say Facebook will no longer engage in fact checking. It's going to move to a kind of Twitter model or X model of free speech. And also, they're removing all DEI positions. There's been a trend of corporations retreating from DEI, woke stuff. Over the past year, especially, there were some tech firms like Coinbase that began to limit this. And then you also had other firms that were very directly exposed to more conservative consumers who began doing this, or conservative of a certain type. Whether it was Bud Light, Anheuser-Busch faced a huge backlash over its botched trans marketing campaign. Then you had other groups like Target, which caters to families. Tractor Supply, a little known company probably here in New York, where I'm recording this, but a company that caters to Red America. Harley Davidson also was retreating from DEI, but now Facebook, that is on a whole other level. So there is a vibe shift going on, and it's having real consequences, both in terms of moderation and who gets employed and who doesn't. And what should we make of it?
It's if I could just jump in, it's very difficult to kind of put my finger on what's happening here, because the impulse behind things like information control, even just sort of like wokeness in general, that appear to be retreating, is a broader cultural ethos of distrust in human ability to sort of see something or hear something, reflect on it, and act accordingly. There's this sort of like stimulus response model, like human beings, just like lab rats. You put a rat next to some kind of stimulus and they're going to respond in the exact same way, just totally unmediated. And this leads to this kind of frenzied desire to control narratives as a way of controlling behavior, because human behavior can be quite unpredictable, and that makes it very difficult to govern. So if the desire to control a narrative is a desire to control behavior. And I don't think this is going to disappear overnight, because that underlying ethos, that ultimately it's people choosing badly, doing the wrong things, not behaving the way that their betters think they should, or that economists say they ought to, that this underlies all social problems. I don't think that's gone away. And I think a lot of people who harp on about freedom, who've taken up the mantle of freedom, I don't think they believe in that either. How many people I hear sort of extolling the virtues of freedom on one hand, and then with the other sort of talking about, oh, well, it's just human nature. So you can tell that I hate that phrase by how many times I say it sort of disparagingly. So superficially, we might do away with all of this, but we haven't done away with its underlying push, which is a kind of pervasive misanthropy, a kind of misanthropic ethos. And if we want to have these kinds of, we want to see a return these kinds of norms, these liberal in the sort of classical sense, going back to the French Revolution, going back to the Enlightenment, these ideas of reason and the belief in the human ability to exercise reason, and therefore to, not no. To say that people are reasonable or rational doesn't mean that they always get things right, but it just means that you have this sort of ability to reflect and make a decision on the basis of that kind of reflection. That's what underlies our liberal democratic societies. If you don't believe in that, you don't really believe in democracy. And that's really been slipping away. And actually, what I like about the doing away with the fact checkers that's been promised, supposedly been rolled out now, and going toward community notes, is that it's based on that. It's based on this idea of the wisdom of crowds, which is also based on what our jury system is based on. And for a while, we were going toward this sort of tyranny of the experts. And it was just sort of, taken for granted that, of course, obviously, you should be an expert. And actually, the uneducated, should their votes really be weighted in the same, at the same level as someone who's educated? Maybe we should do it. And that was like something that people would talk about just openly and think they were being progressive. And so, if we want to kind of walk that back, well, we have to understand that liberalism, the reason why that was done away with, or why that was eroding, is that liberalism keeps running up against its own limitations within the current order of things. And that means that what ultimately freedom means is that you have a say in how your life will be run. But that can only be taken so far. And okay, so maybe you can choose your representatives from time to time, but you can't really have a say over, for instance, how the economy will be run. But increasingly, people are going to want that. You give people freedom. You say you have democratic control. You say that this society is a reflection of your voting or what you want. Then people are going to look at the state of their lives and their children's lives, and they're going to be like, well, what happened to the good factory jobs? Why can't I afford a house? I want that. I want to know what's going on. Why can't I have that? And the technocrats who kind of fiddle with things at a higher level are quite certain that people can't have that. It's quite silly that people are demanding too much. They're making the wrong choices. Why won't they understand that they can't just demand higher wages? It's going to cause inflation. People are just so dumb. They need more guidance and less democratic say, if anything. So you have all these, that's just one example, but you have all of these rationales that come out to sort of draw this cordon sanitaire around democracy to limit its impacts, to enmesh all these important functions of society in like 10 different stages of governance. The EU is a good example of this. And this sort of, it limits or it buffers the effects that any one vote can actually, or any one everyday person can have on the important runnings of society. And I don't think we've done away with any of that. I don't think we've done away with the underlying ethos. And we've suddenly come up with this belief. Oh, yes. If there was another pandemic tomorrow, would we suddenly believe actually people can choose how to behave? We'd think, no, of course they're just going to go outside and cough in your grandmother's face. Like, of course, why? Why would people do that? Well, it's just human nature, isn't it? I think as long as we have not really tackled the underlying force that led those in power and led people to think it was for the best, to control information, to control behavior, to limit democracy, to limit free speech, to limit harm, we are just going to see the same things again, but in a different guise. And I don't want to be too pessimistic, but I'm just saying, be vigilant. This stuff's not going to go away overnight, because the underlying trends that fed it are still there.
So I will also say, I think the turn to community notes has been, one of the only features of Elon era Twitter /X that I generally think has been quite salutary. I agree that that's at least one sort of positive development here. It just seems like community notes works well. And I imagine it'll certainly work better. We at Compact have even experienced like just posting our articles on Facebook. They are often just arbitrarily taken down by Facebook's automated censorship policies, which, and many of these articles are like not even particularly spicy ones. It's very, very strange. So it was clearly a completely broken system that was sort of rigged up overnight to respond to various kinds of constituent pressure. A few things I'll note. one, it's been interesting to see the reaction that, there have really been people. I listen sometimes to this New York Times tech podcast called Hard Fork, which, does kind of represent the views of tech journalists who, you can more or less imagine are, very, on average, very worried about misinformation and things like this. I will say that, they're not always completely doctrinaire. They did actually say that for example, the arrest of Pavel Durov in France earlier this year, the Telegram CEO, that they did address that as a concerning development, and that they did actually think there was something to be worried about there in terms of state overreach. And so they're not, 100% predictable on these issues, but, listening to their reaction to the Meta thing, it was like, they were basically saying people are going to get killed because they were actually declaring people are going to get killed because these fact checkers have been retired. They didn't seem compelled to provide any evidence that these fact checkers have saved any lives, and or that the absence thereof has led directly to anybody's death. They just simply declared that people are going to get killed because of this. So, that there is a real hysteria about the kind of loss of control that this seems to represent for some. But, I think overall, outside of a certain media bubble, I would guess that most of this isn't regarded as particularly dramatic. I think we should, again, kind of situate it within this larger vibe shift. There was kind of a hilarious piece in the FT yesterday that was widely shared. This clip where about the sort of retirement of, DEI and various sort of HR forms of HR oversight in the banking industry on Wall Street. Where a top banker is quoted as saying, "I feel liberated. We can say R word and P word without the fear of getting canceled. It's a new dawn." So there is this kind of somewhat hilarious response. But, I think, as Ashley said, I've seen people debating, does this show that the kind of corporate wokeness of the past decade, which peaked around 2020, was largely a facade, contrary to the critiques of some on the right who argued that it was really just kind of fundamental to the new elite, regime that's been imposed, and that, this ideology was, sort of baked into how all of these institutions function today. Whereas, and so some people who objected to that characterization are arguing now, well, the fact that all these companies are sort of walking back all of this stuff so quickly suggests that it really was a superficial facade. I would sort of endorse Ashley's view here, which, as I understand it, is sort of that, this was one particular manifestation of this broader drive to kind of control and manage, human beings and the human psyche, which is driven by this kind of deep pessimism that, informs this kind of broader managerial ethos, this sort of pessimism about human nature that underwrites these attempts at, to regulate and control. And so, this was one particular and often particularly extreme form that this has taken. So now I think what we need to look out for is how this impulse to manage and control that is, I would argue, kind of hardwired into how many of these institutions function, and is their kind of guiding ethos. How it manifests itself, if this particular set of rationales and justifications, which, you can still find people expressing, like those podcast hosts who are like, well, fact checking was literally saving lives, and now that it's retired, it's going to lead to genocide or something. That this this idea is still out there, but if this particular set of rationales is kind of losing its appeal, then the question is what supplants it, or what comes in to provide it with a new set of justifications as this particular set of ones kind of becomes discredited.
I have to say that you saying the R word and the P word was somehow even more hilarious than the original quote.
I've got to try to keep this podcast family friendly. That's I'm just don't want to get us categorized as an adults only podcast. We want to keep the kids listening.
Things haven't changed because you don't feel comfortable enough to say
I
the
guess
R word.
I'm not liberated like this top banker.
Yeah, it's a gradual liberation. The Allied troops will reach you eventually, I'm sure. It's been fascinating to see the shift. There are a few things behind it. Certainly, one is the dissatisfaction in the tech world with the Biden administration, which I think encouraged people, that distaste for the regulation you had coming from Lena Khan, from others, from European regulatory bodies, is an important factor here, along with what I'm sure are real grievances that Zuckerberg and Bezos have with their woker subordinates, who I'm sure they find annoying in various ways. So that's part of it. I also think that we've seen a real shock to the system of elite institutions that began not just on November 6th, but on October 7th. And that's when you began to see some, very high members of the American power elite say, I'm not sure about the direction of this progressive activism and the whole system we have built up around it. And that brought conflict to the heart of elite universities. And there's reason to think that universities are reorienting themselves, but really it's the Trump win that has forced people to move on these things, because people fear regulatory action and other kinds of reprisals from the Trump administration and retribution for their woke policies. They want to get ahead of that, and they want to get the new administration in their corner. The fact that J.D. Vance is talking about placing a 35% tax on large university endowments, I'm sure is something that university presidents are inclined to take seriously. The congressional hearings were a disaster for elite universities. They conceive of themselves as the great and the good and really above reproach, and they were humiliated, and a bunch of them lost their jobs. So, and it wasn't just, Claudine Gay, but there was a member of the Harvard Board of Overseers who was giving her legal advice. I can't remember the whole story, but he was prepping her for that encounter, and he did a horrible job. Horrible. So it's just an indication that these people don't really know what they're doing, and it was embarrassing for more people than the ones who just happened to be in front of the committee. So, yeah, the election of Trump was very big. One thing that one lesson I think that the right is learning is that there's no substitute for winning. There are just countless columns written over the last 8 years, really saying, if Trump were to win, or if the right were to notch this political victory, it would really undermine everything the right wants to achieve. If we were to achieve anything, we would achieve nothing. Any success, however minor, would undermine our broader goals, and that doesn't seem to be the case. It's certainly the Trump admin won't work out entirely well for the right. I'm sure it will serve to discredit it or elements of it in certain ways, but as a rule in life, winning is better than losing. Health is better than sickness. So it's just been funny to see the really large-scale refutation of so many columns that have been written by conservative columnists, patiently explaining to their readers why to win the right must lose.
On your point about the sort of superficial facade, that was kind of what I was getting at. Like, a facade implies that there was something underneath, and you'd said, it's this kind of I like the way that you put it, which was a lot clearer than the way that I put it, but just this sort of cynical idea about human nature. But also, it's worthwhile to remember that the Trudeaus of the world were the kindly face of authoritarianism, that wokeness and anti-racism were masks for authoritarianism, in the sense that they justify taking away freedoms on the basis of keeping people safe, keeping a minority safe, or keeping the ill and the vulnerable safe, but somebody being protected, right? And it was just as, it also racially scapegoated. All the talk about white people, this racial, gee, I mean, what could go wrong? Let's scapegoat this entire racial group. When have we done that before? And I had joked, years ago, about, and I wasn't even joking. I said, we're going to see the hardcore return of anti-Semitism. I'm 100% certain of it, because like I was on this listserv for indigenous psychology and indigenous sociology, and it was like overnight it became so hardcore, like echoing fascism. Like, people should read fascist texts so they don't accidentally start repeating them, because I could have hit like Control F and gone through these emails and like replace white people with Jews, and it sounded like friggin' Mein Kampf. I swear, it was the vitriol and it was just like, oh, everything that's wrong with the world, white people. It was just a way of saying Jews. And then of course it was like October 7th, mask off, completely mask off. And so it was kind of inevitable that was going to happen. But it's like, what underlies sort of fascism and that sort of thing, and this long trajectory is this degradation of humanity. And all that we have done is, instead of saying like, okay, some people are on a pedestal here, we just tossed everybody down. Oh, we've made so much progress. It's not just that Black people are horrible. All humans are horrible. Oh, okay, well that's great. And so I this is the point that I was trying to get across, is like, that underlying thrust, that authoritarian thrust, hasn't gone away. And it was always a right-wing thing. It just got a superficial facade. And I don't know, what's it going to be now? Just mask off? And I don't want to be like, I don't want to get Trump derangement syndrome. I feel it like a brainworm gradually making its way in. And I'm trying very hard. And I think Chris Coutrone's article that we had in Compact was such a great corrective to this sort of, why not Greenland? Because he had written an article that also, he's getting canceled now for this, but he'd written an article some years ago for which he was also excommunicated, or nearly, which was why not Trump. And it forced me to think like, oh, not all, because as a annoying lefty, all roads lead back to fascism, and you always have to kind of slap yourself upside the head. And that was a great kind of article to do that, to kind of think about the fact that like not everybody you don't like is Hitler. But nonetheless, I do fear that this, things will not turn